Great. So hello everyone, my name is Tony Lynham. I'm a conservation scientist and I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society. On behalf of the Association for Tropical Biodiversity and Conservation, I'd like to welcome you all here today. My co-host this evening is Tim Bonebrake. Tim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Tim Bonebrake, Associate Professor Ecology and Biodiversity at the University of Hong Kong, and also a member of the ATBC Conservation Committee.
Great, thanks, Tim. Well, the emergence of zoonotic diseases over the last 20 years, MERS, SARS, Ebola and Avian flu, and now COVID-19 have affected us in myriad ways that could never have been predicted. Some of these diseases rank very high on the list of global impacts to human well-being. Where did they come from? And what does the future hold for tropical biodiversity as COVID-19 moves around the world? We're going to address those questions tonight. Over to you, Tim.
Sure. So this webinar is the first in a series for 2020 hosted by ATBC. We've invited 3 world experts in the fields of wildlife trade, One Health, and climate change to think about the impacts of COVID-19, tell us how we might be able to mitigate these impacts, and provide predictions for how biodiversity and wild places might be conserved in the future. So in the first hour, we'll hear each of the 3 speakers back to back. If you have any questions, there's a Q&A section within Zoom. So you can post the questions to the Q&A section. Once all the speakers are finished, we'll then move into the Q&A for the second hour. And we'll be asking all the questions from the Q&A to all the speakers. So without further ado, our first speaker this evening is Astrid Anderson, a wildlife trade specialist and indeed a colleague of mine at the University of Hong Kong. Astrid is a National Geographic explorer whose research centers on the critically endangered yellow-crested cockatoo and also broader issues of wildlife trade. Previous to her PhD research, Astrid was the founder of Hong Kong for Pangolins, and as a journalist covered a wide range of environmental issues all across Asia. So I'm very pleased to introduce Astrid, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tim. That was a very nice introduction. Okay, let me just share my screen then. Is that working? Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks to ATBC for organizing this webinar on this very topical issue. As Tim said, I'm Astrid from the University of Hong Kong, finishing up a PhD on exotic bird trade as well as urban biodiversity. And I also specialize in wildlife trade research, which is what I'm here to talk about today in terms of COVID-19. So the many details about this virus are still unknown, including its transmission route. But what we do know is that it has its origins in nature. A study in 2008 showed that 75% of novel pathogens in the preceding 30 years had come from animals. And it's also been shown through scientific studies that coronaviruses specifically are harbored in bats as the reservoir species. Even the novel COVID-19 has been identified as being probably sourced from a bat originally, before it was then in an intermediate host, which scientists have hypothesized that is a mammal. The pangolin, bamboo rat, and mink have all been indicated as potential intermediate hosts. And then it spilled over into humans with the devastating impacts on health and economy that we currently see. The second speaker, Lucy, will probably talk about this in a bit more detail, but just to give you an overview, zoonoses can emerge in a variety of contexts. We typically consider them to be coming from what we consider wild animals, and often in developing countries, it's kind of seen by Western countries as an over there problem. But zoonoses actually also emerge in contexts involving what we typically would consider domestic animals like chickens or pigs, in the case of avian flu and swine flu. And even COVID-19 has been present en masse in mink farms across Europe, in Spain and the Netherlands. And correct me if I'm wrong, Lucy, later, but from what I understand, it's not clear whether the minks are giving it to the humans or the humans are giving it to the minks. And they also emerge in developed countries. So it's very difficult to create comprehensive regulation that covers all of these different areas. And viruses are emerging with increasing frequency due to our increasingly intense interactions with nature and wildlife. Deforestation provides the opportunity for pathogens to spill over to humans by triggering a cascade of events. So we go into these wild places and we encounter wildlife that contains novel pathogens that we haven't encountered before. And then we prolong that exposure by establishing a long-term interface with these wild places when we convert the land into other uses, or agricultural encroachment, for example, where there is domesticated livestock that is providing multiple opportunities for this spillover to occur. And then with wildlife trade, we extract wild animals from these situations and transport them domestically, and sometimes internationally also. We bring other species together from different sources, often in unhygienic conditions that are conducive to disease spread. And viruses do not discriminate. They will spill over regardless of the purpose of this wildlife trade. So be it for fur industry or food indeed, or fashion or exotic pets. And it also doesn't matter if the activity is legal or illegal. So again, this multifaceted situation is quite difficult to regulate comprehensively to mitigate the spread of zoonotic disease through these activities. Wildlife trade is enormous in both scope and scale. As you can see, it involves a number of species traded from, well, this is legal wildlife trade, everything from seafood to wild meat, pets, and it really does involve all different countries across the world. The legal trade is estimated to be worth around 200 billion US a year, while the illegal trade, which operates in parallel, is estimated anywhere between 7 to 23 billion. I mean, it's very difficult to keep track of that and monitor that because it operates in a clandestine nature. So one of the countries that has made the most comprehensive attempt to regulate wildlife trade in response to COVID-19 is China. I've prepared a timeline, which is by no means exhaustive, but it involves some of the actions that have been taken, and it gives you an idea of the type of actions. You'll see central government actions shown in orange, and civil society input in green, and then provincial level activities in purple. Excuse me. And you'll also see that the actions cover both hunted, wildlife, but also domestic, farmed or bred animals, as well as legal and illegal wildlife trade. So after Xi Jinping directly addressed the link between wildlife trade and zoonotic outbreak, there was quickly action from the central government. They announced the plan to revise the wildlife protection law within the year. They also fast-tracked a ban on the consumption and trade in wild animals, although the details of this have been ironed out, are still being ironed out in the following months. And civil society has provided their input on what animals should be protected under the wildlife protection law revision. And here they also ordered tighter regulations on wildlife farming and delegated this activity to the provincial level governments. And then we see more of the same, the civil society giving their input on what animals should be included in the wildlife trade ban, or what that kind of should entail. And the central government directing the provincial government to compensate breeders. They also initiated a whitelist of animals that you're allowed to farm, and that drafts are being released, which the public can comment on. And then in the last few months, we've seen some of these provincial level governments implement the various policies according to the demography of their local area. And a top level official also mentioned a severe crackdown on illegal wildlife trade at the National People's Congress. So as you can see, it's kind of coming from all these different angles and providing pretty good coverage. There has, of course, been some challenges implementing these policy measures. The academics in their feedback pointed to the exceptions that exist for wildlife that is being used for purposes other than food. So anything used for fashion or medicinal or exhibitional research purposes is not covered under the wildlife trade ban, which is a bit of a problem because high-risk mammals like the raccoon dogs that you see in this picture here are typically bred for fur industry. And other high-risk mammals like pangolins, for example, will be bred for medicinal or research purposes, not food. So this, by having these exemptions built into the law, it doesn't eliminate the risk for zoonotic disease spread. Rather, it leaves areas where that could continue to happen. Logistically, there's also been issues. The provincial level governments have had problems with what they're going to do with all the confiscated wildlife. In February, it was estimated that there was around 25 million bamboo rats in southern China. And in the following months, there was a lot of media reports about live burials and mass cullings, which is not ideal from a health and safety perspective. There's also been reports that they will rehabilitate these animals and release them, which is not sound ecologically unless it's done very thoroughly. And then there's also been repurposing. The snake farmers in Guangxi have, with the government's assistance, transitioned their farms, their captive bred snakes, from being for a food purpose to being for beauty and medicinal purposes. So again, this enables these sort of high-risk activities to continue. There's also been problems with definitions. So the academics and other civil society organizations providing their input on the farming list have pointed to the fact that species that we would typically consider to be wild, such as deer or pheasants, are actually included on the farming list. That it's not just pigs and cows and domesticated wildlife. And some of the animals included on the list in the current draft version are also protected. The Sika deer, for example, is a class 1 protected species. So that's an inconsistency that's been pointed out. In terms of implementation, the top-down approach, distilling it to municipal level, has seemed to work pretty well, even down to a city level, as you can see in the examples there. However, we need to make sure that the enforcement is still maintained at an even level across the board and for a long period of time, so that, again, we don't enable these areas to emerge where zoonotic disease can grow and spread. Because if we found out anything from this COVID-19 experience, it's that this hyper-connected world, all it takes is for one weak link, so to speak, to leak a virus and then for the whole world to end up in a pandemic. And by that token, we also need to look, other countries need to follow suit, because as I illustrated in the slide with the map there, wildlife trade is truly international. And there are even these wet markets that people have been talking about. They exist throughout South and Southeast Asia. They're also in Africa, and Europe and United States also hunt for game meat, everything from deer to hare to wild boar. And I don't think that's particularly regulated. And exotic pet trade is a very high risk area. Actually, there are animals being traded in exotic pet trade that currently do have disease, like chytrid fungus disease in amphibians has been spread throughout the Americas in the native populations of frogs because of wildlife trade. And also cytosine beak and feather disease is now spreading to passerine birds in Europe, the native populations, because it's being transported across borders and it's now mutating and evolving. But because it hasn't passed on to humans, we haven't really seen a comprehensive response in terms of regulating and monitoring wildlife trade, even though this is diseased animals are being traded. And finally, as I mentioned before, the mink farms in the Netherlands and Spain have seen an outbreak of COVID, and the fur trade is common across many European countries. So we need to take a look at our own high-risk areas and respond accordingly with regulations in certain areas that we consider to be, inadequately regulated at the moment, because the current system that we have will not prevent the next pandemic. It's already shown to be inadequate. In tandem with that, we can make use of regional or international frameworks to implement tighter regulations. So the EU, after the 2005 outbreak of avian flu, they banned wild bird trade that could be extended to other species or captive bred animals, or it can also be replicated throughout ASEAN or other regional networks. The Convention for the International Trade in Endangered Species, that is currently, the mandate is just to avoid overexploitation, but it could be expanded to include health considerations. The management authorities, when they produce permits to trade certain species, could take into account zoonotic risk, or there could even be a new appendix which lists species according to their disease risk. There could also be a new protocol on the UN Convention for Biological Diversity, or a binding WHO agreement. However, if we are successful in improving our current system and regulating wildlife trade better and monitoring and keeping at least hygiene standards to an acceptable level, then we will need to make sure that we crack down on wildlife crime, because we run the risk of that all going underground, where it's much harder to keep a track of what's going on, and conditions could arguably be even more conducive to zoonotic spread. So immediate steps include classifying wildlife crime as organized crime, because that provides prosecutorial powers with the ability to dole out higher penalties. And it also helps customs and police to have better investigatory powers. They can seize assets, and they can go beyond just catching the mules. They can create impact that actually affects the entire network and is more impactful, basically. And we do not currently have an international agreement on wildlife crime, but a new protocol could be adopted under the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, similar to the one that we have for human trafficking. So I know I've been talking a lot about national and international policy and things, but at the end of the day, and also at this moment in time, we are aware of how we really are a global society and how our actions can have ripple effects across the globe. So on an individual level, we can make consumption choices that minimize deforestation, for example, because if left intact, these wild areas are natural barriers against zoonotic disease emergence. If we have the means to, we can protect and we can support financially these protected areas. And we can also, reflect on the luxury industries that have these high-risk mammals or other animals in precarious situations, such as the fur industry, specialty cuisine, exotic pets. Do we really need them, and are they worth the risk? As I said, at the moment, we have the political will and the resources to do this. We have public opinion is they're not prepared to live in a situation where there's pandemic after pandemic, and they're willing to listen to what they should do to prevent it, I believe. So it's a good opportunity for diversifying and job creation in sustainable industries, or just improving our relationship with the natural world and avoiding the situation that we currently have. So with that, I'll leave you with words from David Quammen, who can say it much better than I can. He's the author of Spillover, and thank you.
Thank you, Astrid. We'll take questions for Astrid at the end of the three talks. So please do send in questions, and we'll curate them and we'll present them to the speakers at the end. So now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Lucy Keats, who's a wildlife disease specialist from the Wildlife Conservation Society. Lucy advises the WCS One Health program, which uses veterinary and wildlife health expertise to save wildlife in wild places around the globe. Lucy has extensive experience in managing surveillance activities for zoonotic emerging diseases in wildlife, livestock, and humans at high-risk transmission interfaces using a One Health approach. So I'd like to welcome Lucy. Over to you, Lucy.
Right, thanks, Tony, for the introduction. I'll share my screen. Is that working okay? Can you guys hear me okay? Thanks, okay. And for some reason, there we go. Thanks so much, Tony, for the introduction, and for everyone who's taken the time to listen in today. As Tony said, my name's Lucy Keats. I'm a veterinarian and I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society's health program. We work on a broad range of issues around at the interface of wildlife and humans and domestic animals. And today I'm going to talk more about the concept of One Health around COVID-19. So it made sense to start just with a basic understanding of what does One Health mean. The concept of One Health, in the most simplest terms, we can think of this triad, which is really a recognition of the interconnectedness of the health of the environment, animals, and people. But I quite like this image from the CDC, which really captures the approach of One Health, where all the people working in these different parts of the triad and beyond come together in a collaborative, dynamic, transdisciplinary approach to work together at local, national, and global levels with the goal of achieving optimal health for all, at every aspect of the triad. I think today there is broad consensus that health encompasses a lot more than just parasites and pathogens, and it needs to incorporate the social aspects, economic, political, evolutionary, and environmental factors. In terms of a pandemic such as COVID-19, a One Health approach to responding and preventing future pandemics recognizes that no one group or sector in society holds enough knowledge or resources to prevent the emergence or resurgence of diseases. And we absolutely critically must start to work better together to respond and protect and improve the health and well-being of our species in today's globalized world. So we'll start with what do we know, and because my talk's on One Health, and that's really quite a broad term, I'm afraid there'll probably be a little overlap with Astrid's talk and possibly Colin's too. So I won't dwell too much because probably a lot of you are familiar, but zoonoses are diseases that move between animals and humans. COVID-19, there's general consensus that it's a zoonotic disease and it's caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2. In the past, zoonotic diseases primarily came from livestock, and research looking back has demonstrated that in the 5,000 years following humans' widespread adoption of the agricultural lifestyle, the population growth of people nearly froze, and it's postulated that that's likely because of the skyrocketing epidemics of zoonotic diseases passing from livestock to humans. Now we've kind of adapted to live with those diseases, and just measles was an example that we think was a divergence of recombination of rinderpest viruses. Now we've adapted to live with livestock. They still harbor zoonoses, but we are familiar with a lot of them. But in recent decades, the majority of emerging zoonotic diseases, over 70% of outbreaks, have originated in wildlife. And the rate of emergence of zoonotic diseases is increasing. We've had more than 50 emerging infectious disease events every decade from 1940 onward. And this increase in the rate of emergence of zoonotic diseases is mirrored by an increase in anthropogenic determinants. So this suggests that these increases are not just improved detection and documentation, but are actually driven primarily by an increased contact rate between humans, our domestic animals, and wildlife due to anthropogenic land use changes, increased access to formerly intact wild areas, and our increasing extraction of and global trade in natural resources. So in terms of the impacts of COVID-19 so far, obviously the most devastating impacts have been to human health. There's now over 15 million cases worldwide and over 600,000 deaths in 213 countries and territories. This chart kind of shows a nice demonstration of the movement globally shifting of where we're seeing the increased reporting of cases, with the pink on the left being China and North Asia, the navy being Europe, and now we're shifting over to seeing explosions of cases in Latin America, other parts of Asia, and of course the US. In addition to these devastating impacts on public health, emerging zoonoses also have massive implications for economic stability. The cost of recent emerging disease outbreaks such as SARS, MERS, and Ebola were estimated in the tens of billions of US dollars, which at the time seemed huge. But the economic devastation from COVID-19 is estimated to be orders of magnitude greater. McKinsey and Company recently estimated a minimum economic loss globally of 9 trillion US dollars, and potentially much higher, into the tens of trillions. The IMF's threshold to classify a major economic disaster is a loss of 0.5% of GDP. And while SARS, MERS, and Ebola have exceeded 1 to 2% of GDP loss in some less wealthy countries, COVID-19 is forecast to result in a global GDP contracting by 3.8% or more in 2020, and even more severe contraction in certain countries, especially where tourism has been lost. So these economic impacts, of course, have multiple and far-reaching knock-on effects, which just ties into this concept of One Health and how interrelated everything is. So I'm just going to touch on a few of those today, including some of the impacts on conservation. We've already seen that financial strain in some communities has led to a return to hunting and increased poaching in some areas. And we've seen reports of that from Latin America to Africa and Asia. Enforcement efforts in a lot of protected areas have decreased as a result of lockdowns, job losses, reassignments, illness. And this has led to an increased ease of poaching, trafficking, deforestation, logging, and forest fire setting, all of which, of course, have severe impacts on conservation. The travel restrictions globally have frozen the ecotourism industry, and that industry underpins a really symbiotic human-wildlife ecosystem in a lot of areas. Loss of employment and income, either directly from the job loss or from halted stakeholder payments from wildlife conservancies, has resulted in a loss of the financial incentive to conserve wildlife and wild places. We're seeing in some areas such as the Masai Mara, grassland communities considering a return to grazing, which will jeopardize decades of conservation efforts to shift away from these practices. And then, of course, emerging infectious diseases don't just affect human health. They also have implications for animal health. So far, humans are known to have passed on COVID-19 infection to their dogs and their domestic cats. We know that an asymptomatic keeper in the US passed on coronavirus to a tiger in the Bronx Zoo. And there are also infections in other tigers and lions at the zoo. As Astrid mentioned, in Holland and Spain, there's been huge outbreaks in mink. In a lot of these animals, we've just seen mild to moderate disease, but in mink, certainly we've seen increased mortality. And based on natural observations, some infection experiments and other lab studies that have been done, we know that many other animal species are potentially susceptible to SARS-CoV-2. Ferrets, along with the mink, hamsters. We know tigers and lions, macaques are also susceptible, though we don't know if they can transmit between each other. Dogs, certain fruit bat species, tree shrews and marmosets, we know are susceptible, but unlikely to further transmit the virus. And most old world primates are likely susceptible, as well as a high number of distantly related mammal species, ranging from sheep to orcas even, have been demonstrated potentially susceptible. There's basically examples from every mammalian order. So clearly these diseases have implications for animal health as well as human health. There certainly exists some concern for what we call spillback when humans infect wildlife. So the zoonosis passes to humans and then back into animals. For infection of wildlife such as bats, which could potentially become a reservoir of the virus. And in the past, studies of bats that were infected with SARS-CoV-1 did not show signs of disease, so they could potentially become asymptomatic carriers, which would be a challenge for disease control. There's also concern, of course, for endangered wildlife, and in particular species that are genetically close to us, such as non-human primates. We know that other human respiratory viruses have led to severe disease and mortality in those animals. And in many cases, great ape and other ecotourism was halted very early in the spread of pandemic to reduce the risk of potential spillback for those animals. So as Astrid said, there's still a lot of questions about the SARS-CoV origin. Comparative generic analysis suggests it's evolved naturally, and bats are the most likely ancestral reservoir host. The closest known relative has been detected in bats in Yunnan province. And we know that it's one of 3 bat coronaviruses known to cause disease in humans. While SARS-CoV-2 shows some genetic similarity with SARS-CoV that emerged in 2002-2003 from horseshoe bats as a wild reservoir host. And that was considered to have spilled over into humans via an intermediate masked palm civet in a market in China. However, it's actually not that closely related to SARS-CoV, and you can see that it evolved in this chart on the right from a distinct phylogenetic lineage. And there's really just a huge unexplored diversity of bat coronaviruses in China. A couple of scenarios have been put forth to explain the spillover of SARS-CoV-2, possibly evolution in an intermediate mammal host, as Astrid mentioned, which is as yet unknown, potentially in a wildlife market or elsewhere, or natural evolution in humans following zoonotic transfer from bats. Many, but not all, initial COVID cases were linked to a seafood market in Wuhan that traded wildlife, and 31 of 33 positive environmental samples from the market were found in an area trading wildlife. However, it's now known that there were earlier human cases, and the exact time, place, and mechanism for the spillover is likely to never be elucidated. Whilst pangolins were proposed at one point as a possible intermediate host, the coronaviruses in pangolins are actually too different to be the direct ancestor. But some recent research looking at pangolins that are at the source that feeds into that wildlife trade didn't find any evidence of coronaviruses. And the authors of that research suggest that pangolins were likely infected somewhere along the wildlife trade chain. And so greater surveillance along that train and understanding could give us some clues of where SARS-CoV-2 originated also. And I think the take-home message with considering all emerging diseases in SARS-CoV-2 is that it's not just about civets or pangolins or bats, but that a novel virus could be lurking in any of these or other taxa, and it's the conditions within wildlife trade that facilitate spillover. Some recent research by WCS looking at the rodent trade chain in Vietnam found that there was an increased prevalence and diversity of coronaviruses as you moved along the trade chain from the village and middleman to the markets and onto the restaurants. The commercial live wildlife trade and markets really create a super interface. They commingle species from different geographies and habitats that would not normally come into contact. And the conditions within that trade facilitate the formation of new viruses through reassortment, realignment, and exchange of viral components among a diversity of wildlife species. And sometimes these novel viruses are then capable of entering and multiplying in a human cell and potentially causing human-to-human transmission. So once a mammal or a bird enters the commercial wildlife supply chain, the risk of viral emergence and transmission increases significantly. And especially in large urban areas, this poses a significant risk to global health and security. The handling and housing of animals in wildlife trade chains leads to multiple stresses that inhibit an animal's immune response, and they allow for enhanced shedding of pathogens. Stress also tends to lead to increased excretion of saliva, voiding of urine and feces, and all of these factors facilitate the shedding of virus. And of course, not only do animals exchange the viruses potentially among themselves between species, but vendors and customers are also circulating within this milieu, handling the animals, often with slaughtering and being conducted in the same area. So there's, beyond wildlife trade, also as Astrid mentioned, there's a growing body of evidence demonstrating that ecological degradation in general increases the overall risk of emerging infectious diseases spilling over from wildlife. 80% of terrestrial and marine regions globally are substantially altered by people. And it's estimated that only 40% of forest areas remaining have a high landscape level integrity. This graph on the right, it kind of looks like slices of cheese, it is a nice one that demonstrates that the spillover of a pathogen from animals into humans requires a series of stages to align and is actually quite a rare event. Factors can be associated with the reservoir host, the pathogen itself, environmental and physical barriers, and human biological factors. In the past, spillover events in remote areas with little or no health infrastructure and limited connectivity were likely underreported, and they probably occurred but died out fairly rapidly in small and isolated populations of people. But now we have increased our connectivity with these pristine regions. So a spillover event can potentially expose a much greater number of naive hosts who can then spread the infection to peri-urban and urban centers, obviously potentially leading to epidemics and pandemics. The key ingredients that accentuate the risk of a spillover event from ecological degradation are activities in areas of high biodiversity that elevate contact rates between humans and certain wildlife species. And such activities could be agricultural intensification, land conversion, road building, and anything that creates these new habitat edges in particular, as well as poaching for trade. And these edges, as you can see along this road and this pristine forest, really are the front lines for the next spillover. It's been demonstrated for diseases such as Nipah virus in Malaysia, Hendra in Australia, Ebola virus outbreaks have been linked to forest fragmentation in West Africa, because it just increases our contact with wildlife species. A recent study this year by Chris Johnson and all found that more zoonotic diseases were identified in threatened species facing decline in habitat or high pressure from exploitation compared with species threatened for other reasons. In the Asia Pacific region, there's been research that's shown that the number of zoonotic disease outbreaks in a region is correlated positively with the number of threatened animal and bird species. And in addition to increasing the risk of emerging infectious diseases from wildlife, ecosystem degradation has complex effects with often other negative impacts on human health. And that includes the prevalence of endemic vector-borne and waterborne diseases, air quality, nutrition, and mental health, and access to traditional medicines, as well as through the impacts of climate change, which Colin will speak to more. So in terms of what do we know about all the potential viruses in these wildlife reservoirs? So across what we consider 25 high-risk viral families, we only know of 263 viruses that infect humans. Recent research, which is based on analysis of recent viral discovery data, suggests that there are 1.7 million unknown viruses in birds and mammals. And it's estimated that around 700,000 of these likely have the potential to infect humans, so they're zoonotic. So if we think about that, for every known coronavirus, there are thousands of unknown coronaviruses circulating in wildlife. So we want to think about understanding those viruses and surveillance in terms of economic benefit. And McKinsey and Company recently estimated that the minimum economic loss from COVID-19 will be $9 trillion. And you can see on this chart on the bottom right, the estimates for investment over the next 10 years. And it really is a financial drop in the bucket compared with the costs of this single pandemic. The return on investment would be clear even if it only partially mitigated potential damage from a pandemic such as COVID-19. And the Global Virome Project, which you can see a little clip on the top right, recommends that just $9 billion would be enough to understand the majority of emerging viruses in high-risk groups of mammals, such as bats, rodents, and non-human primates, which clearly is a worthwhile investment. So healthier ways forward post-COVID-19. Astrid talked to this a bit. One of the most important and cost-effective immediate actions, which China has obviously started to move towards with legislation better than any other country so far, despite certain loopholes, is supporting policy change towards ending the commercial trade in wildlife for human consumption, especially of mammals and birds, which pose the highest risk for spillover. And it's important to identify innovative ways that we can ensure the successful application and enforcement of such legislation. Around these bans, it's very important to recognize that urban and small urban wildlife markets contrast very starkly with the behaviors we see of in terms of exchange and of indigenous and subsistence communities. Urban markets are primarily for luxury consumption or driven by preference of a taste for wildlife meat. They are not driven by a need or for subsistence. And it's important that any bans do not apply to indigenous people or threaten food security. So when you think about potential interventions in the wildlife trade, it's really a great demonstration of a need for a coordinated One Health multidisciplinary approach, from surveillance and research to understand evolving disease threats and to guide evidence-based recommendations, to targeted risk reduction and behavior change interventions or effective policy changes. The motivations, perspectives, and activities from highly diverse stakeholders at these various points along trade chains will need to be addressed in an integrated manner. And that's going to require collaboration of multiple sectors and disciplines in order for effective policy to be developed and for those policies to be sustained and effective over the long term. Beyond ensuring that any trade bans don't negatively impact on indigenous people and subsistence communities, it's really important that we begin to recognize what an invaluable source of knowledge regarding the wildlife they interact with they can be. They can really assist in community-based surveillance efforts and as irreplaceable eyes on the ground and early warning systems. In the Republic of Congo, where Ebola poses a significant health risk to both people and to great apes, WCS has worked with the government to set up an expansive wildlife mortality monitoring network, which has trained hunters and community members in healthy behaviors, as well as the safe monitoring and reporting of carcasses. And it now covers 30,000 square kilometers with over 6,000 hunters and thousands of women and children in the communities trained. And it has really been an invaluable resource in the prevention of Ebola spillover events in the country. In Southeast Asia, we've just started piloting with some local governments a wildlife and community health surveillance to be integrated into the SMART tool, which is now cell phone-based tool used by many rangers around the world, which could enable far-reaching coverage to identify early indicators of wildlife disease and potential spillover events close to their source, which has obvious benefits for both wildlife and human health. Wildlife, as well as humans, can of course be susceptible to devastating emerging infectious disease events. Astrid mentioned, devastating fungal disease, chytrid, which is spreading globally, potentially associated with amphibian trade. And in 2016, there was spillover of a livestock virus, Pesta petit ruminant, from domestic livestock into wild Mongolian saiga, and it wiped out over 80% of the saiga population. So clearly, early detection and response has benefits for conservation and for human health. So generally, healthier ways forward. We, as a civil society and governments and decision makers, fundamentally need to recognize that intact and functional ecosystems provide the infrastructure for all health and well-being on our planet. We need to move to become more precautionary versus the traditional reactive behavior in terms of disease outbreaks and other natural disasters. We need to adopt more precautionary measures and place a greater value on ecosystem services to health, and make positive use of those connections to mitigate risks to ecosystems, human and animal health. This requires implementing integrated measures to address the direct and indirect human-induced drivers of biodiversity loss, of disease emergence, and the loss of ecosystem services that support health and human well-being. Traditionally, biodiversity conservation and ecosystem dynamics have often received less attention in the One Health sphere than the human-animal interconnections in terms of zoonotic disease risk. And correspondingly, there's been lesser consideration of the upstream drivers of ill health and systems. And we need to improve this integration of biodiversity conservation and ecosystems into One Health approaches going forward. And then we need to work to improve the integration of One Health into land use planning. We need improved economic valuation tools to assess multicultural costs and benefits of a proposed use of an ecosystem, such as capturing how forest ecosystems regulate the emergence of novel diseases, how that translates into a forest economic worth that can contribute to multi-pronged efforts to reduce the threats of pandemics and climate change. Often finances speak louder to decision makers, and that's a really important thing that we need to get better at. Better integration of biodiversity conservation into One Health planning will also strengthen the resilience of social ecological systems and help to achieve broader societal and development goals. It's been recently shown that current negative trends in biodiversity and ecosystems will undermine progress towards 80% of the assessed targets of the Sustainable Development Goals, and that includes related to poverty, hunger, health, water, and climate. So again, we see how it's all so intertwined. So in summary, COVID-19 has reminded us that a global proactive One Health pandemic preparedness effort is needed going forward, and it must better emphasize the intimate interconnections between ecosystem health, human health, and social justice, the interactions between biotic and abiotic components, and reflect positive health outcomes for all, from local to global scales. This intrinsically requires better cross-sectoral, multinational, and multi- and transdisciplinary collaboration. If we do not fundamentally change our approach to pandemic preparedness and prevention and reset our relationship with nature, it is only a matter of time before another pandemic emerges from wildlife to further devastating effect. And I'll just hop back, but just a month before the emergence of COVID-19, WCS actually brought together global health leaders in Germany and issued together the Berlin Principles on One Health, which were an urgent call for a united effort to stop diseases threatening all life on Earth. And of course, now, sadly, that's more timely than ever. And I've shared a link to those if anyone's interested in reading them in more detail. So thank you so much for your attention today. And here's a few places where you can find out some more information on the work that we're doing around this. Thanks.
Thank you, Lucy. Our final speaker today is Dr. Colin Carlson, from Georgetown University. He's an expert in global change biology with expertise in data science, ecology, and epidemiology. He has a PhD from UC Berkeley and is currently an assistant research professor at Georgetown. Much of his recent research and science communication work has focused on SARS-CoV-2, and he's been a vocal proponent on ensuring best practices when it comes to science, ecology, and public health in the subject. So I'd really like to welcome Colin. We look forward to hearing more.
Good morning, everyone. Let me pull up this talk. Good evening to people in a different time zone than this one. Can everyone see this okay? I'll assume that's a yes. Great. So I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about climate change and the climate angle on this. I also, in addition to working at Georgetown, run the Verena Consortium, which is an independent team of scientific researchers working on emerging viruses. And a lot of the SARS-CoV-2 work that I've been doing recently ties into that consortium. I'm not going to get too into it today, but to sort of flag it in case it's of interest to people, a lot of our work has been focused on understanding emerging zoonotic diseases and thinking about things like sampling priorities for tracing SARS-CoV-2 back to the wildlife origin. we have this preprint up now, it's in review, in which we talk about essentially using model-guided field work to come up with priorities that we can follow through in the field and in the lab. It gets into a lot of biology of some of these questions, like what could the intermediate host be for SARS-CoV-2? Do we have reasons to think it's something like a mink or another mustelid? It's also a great example of sort of the kind of science that I think matters at a moment like this one, where it's not just about doing science that's productive, but it's about transparency and actionability. We don't just want to produce sampling priorities because it's nice to make a model. We want to follow those through with action. And so if you go to our website, you can see our ongoing effort to track every known host of beta coronaviruses in bats. We keep an ongoing ledger and are coordinating research efforts across several museums in the United States to try to test some of our predictions. Already, as of yesterday, we are up to, I believe, 8 out of 9 correct predictions, which feels pretty good. So it's a great team of people, all pretty early career, coming from a lot of different fields, and sort of trying to unpack a lot of the questions that we're talking about today. There's a lot of different things that I could sort of bring in from that, but I've been asked to talk about climate change, and I think there's a lot to unpack in terms of climate change and COVID. Part of the reason that I think this is a difficult topic, right, is climate change is, there's a lot of different ways to say this, right? It's a hyper object, it's a wicked problem, it's this big messy thing that it's hard to sit in the same room as. There's all of these different dimensions to climate change, and they're not just ecological or geological, but they're also often based in human behavior and in complex choices and decision points and branching futures. And that has a lot of similarities with the pandemic, right? When we think about the intersection of climate change and pandemic preparedness, we're talking about the cross product between two incredibly complex phenomena that span decades and are rooted in everything from daily life decisions up to the global balance of power and trust between countries. And so I think it's hard to put a shape to that. It's especially hard, I think, with COVID, because unlike some previous outbreaks like Zika, where we can sit down and very easily figure out the contribution of climate change, I can't get in front of this audience today and say, well, COVID-19 is the product of climate change, right? You know, there's that Sontag quote about the worst thing you can do is give a meaning to a disease. And with what we know about COVID, I think that's particularly true. We don't really know where SARS-CoV-2 came from yet. We know it probably came from a bat ultimately, but we don't know the intermediate host. We don't know the spillover location. We don't necessarily have a sense of the underlying ecology of the system. And so I think it's very difficult for us to say, well, did climate change contribute to this? Did land use degradation contribute to this? So we have to sort of talk at high levels. And so what I want to talk to you about is the high level view of this. What is this Venn diagram between climate change and the next pandemic? The way that we approach this problem is to say that if we know how things work today, we can make a reasonable guess about how things work tomorrow, right? And this is how we do climate change research. We look at history to inform the future. And that works for emerging diseases as well. If we can understand why diseases emerge today and what the baseline patterns are of the global virome, we can start to think about what the global virome looks like in, say, 50 years. But to do that, we need a set of rules, right? And we want them to be sort of simple, intuitive guidelines for how complex systems work, because there's a lot of moving parts, right? This could get really complicated really fast. So I want to talk about some work that's been done in collaboration with Greg Albury, a postdoc at Georgetown, who did a study this year that actually pulls out these basic rules and does a really nice job of unpacking them. It turns out there's, if you want to explain about 60% of the variation that we see in natural ecosystems in viral sharing patterns, you only really need 2 predictors. It's a very simple model. When we talk about viral sharing, what we mean is any 2 hosts that share any virus. So for example, gorillas and humans share a number of different viruses, right? Starting with Zaire Ebola virus, that would be an example of viral sharing. But there are species that don't share viruses, and there's patterns to this. We like to talk about this in terms of compatibility and opportunity, this idea that for cross-species transmission to happen, and that's the backbone not just of natural ecosystems, but zoonotic emergence, two species have to be able to share a virus, and they have to be in contact. And we see that at global scales, these rules apply. So when we talk about the evolutionary distance between two species, that does a really good job of predicting whether or not they can share a virus. More closely related species have more similar immune systems. Maybe they've co-evolved with particular viral groups. And so they're more likely to share viruses. Think about primates and humans, right? We share a lot of viruses compared to humans and fish. Geography also matters. Species that are in contact with each other are more able to share viruses. And those two rules are the backbone of this messy global pattern. So if we have those rules, we can start to think about what the future looks like, because evolutionary distance doesn't change over 50 years, but geography does. And so the idea of this study, and you can read the preprint now, is fairly simple. We want to understand where species will be in the future. And then we want to predict what we call first encounters, two species that meet for the first time that have never met before. Species are constantly moving because of climate change, and we can reasonably approximate with statistical models where they'll be in 2070. So we say, okay, here's where everything is now. Here's 50 years in the future. Here's where species will meet for the first time. And when they meet, they might share viruses for the first time. You can think of this like a meet cute, right? Bat and gorilla meet on a sidewalk, someone spills papers, and there's your pathway for emergence. And so we're looking for those meet cutes. We're looking for events where species come into contact, and climate change creates opportunity for a virus to make a jump. This is where biodiversity is now, right? But mammal biodiversity is most abundant in the tropics. And if we take this and we shake it like a snow globe, we move all these species around the world, this is where all the viral sharing happens 50 years from now. So there's a few patterns that jump out, right? First of all, it's not happening everywhere. It's still mostly in the tropics, but it doesn't map one-to-one on where species are today. The future looks slightly different from the present. We think that there are some simple patterns we can pull out. We know that most future viral sharing will happen around biodiversity hotspots, and particularly in Central Africa and Southeast Asia. To sort of put a face to this, right? In this study, we moved 3,000 species around the world. And there's a lot in the back end of this, right? We moved them through 4 different scenarios for climate change and land use change, 4 different pathways for how we think species can move, 9 different climate models. It comes out to moving 1 trillion pixels every time we run the model. But there's a very simple set of rules. 3,000 species move, and when they move, they come into contact with new species over 300,000 times. Compared to the current set of overlaps between species, this is essentially a doubling of interspecific contact over 50 years. Essentially remaking global contact patterns from scratch, right? And this is how we know climate change works. So this isn't a surprise, but we're putting it in the language of viral sharing for the first time. When we put this into a model of cross-species transmission, we can say of those, sort of 1/3 first encounters, we think we could get maybe 15,000 cross-species transmission events within the next 50 years that are attributable to climate change. Now there's limits to this, right? If we put realistic assumptions about dispersal into this, those numbers drop a lot. Most species can't keep up with climate change, right? And this is why we know there's going to be a mass extinction crisis, because most species can't track these shifts over the next 50 years. And if they're not tracking those shifts, they're meeting fewer other species, they're sharing fewer viruses. But there's a big exception to that, right? Bats are kind of following their own rules here. We have reason to think that over the next 50 years, the majority of bat species can probably go most places, and that's just the perks of flight. And as a result of that, most of these first encounters are actually driven by bats. And that might seem like a sort of weird result to pull out until you start to think about the fact that bats have been moving incredibly quickly over the last few decades. This is a pattern that has been sort of talked about in isolation, but never really pulled out as this uniform pattern. But bats are also special in terms of viruses, right? Because bats can go incredibly long distances. They can share viruses over continental scales, where a bat in Ghana might have the same virus as a bat in Madagascar. Bats are also special in one other way, right? And we know, not just from COVID-19, but from all of these other recent outbreaks, that bats kind of have this special role in terms of emerging diseases. And we still don't fully know why, right? It could be unique immune adaptations, and there's a beautiful paper in Nature this week about this. It could be that flight changes their immune systems. It could be that they're just incredibly diverse, and that diversity means they have proportionally a lot of viruses. But bats are special. And if bats are driving most of this pattern, we have reason to think that's going to matter in terms of wildlife health and potentially human health, right? Let's take one very small subset of these 15,000 cross-species transmission events. There are about, let's say, a dozen species that we've ever tested as PCR positive or antibody positive in nature for Zaire Ebola virus. And we still don't know the reservoir with a lot of certainty, right? We don't know exactly the species that maintains the virus, but we think, maybe there's about a dozen or so species we know can be infected or have been exposed. They tend to occur in Central and West Africa, in the places where we know there's been Ebola spillovers. And that gives us a really clear sense of the ecology of the virus today. If we run this model just for those 13 species, they come into contact with over 600 other species as they move because of climate change, leading to somewhere around 30 cross-species transmission events. Now, let's play this future out. If 30 new species picked up Zaire Ebola virus, and those species were not in Central Africa where reservoirs are today, but mostly in East Africa and the Rift Valley, in places that we don't normally think of as at risk, that's going to change how we do surveillance, right? It's going to make it much harder for us to keep track of this virus if more species could be carrying it. It's going to make it much harder for us to plan for outbreaks if much bigger areas or new areas are at risk. And that becomes this problem at scale, where we think these viral sharing events will happen disproportionately where people live. This turns out to sort of be a random process. This isn't something we preordained in our study. We didn't want to get this finding. We actually mostly wanted to talk about sort of the natural part of this system. But people tend to live around biodiversity hotspots, at sort of mid elevations. They tend to live in places that are very climatically stable, right? Think about like everything you learned in middle school about the Fertile Crescent. And because people live in those places, that's also where species are going to be moving in the next 50 years. And that's where they'll encounter each other. And so it's sort of a random byproduct of the geography of the system. We think these processes are going to be happening in our backyard. And that happens sort of regardless of what we do. Now, obviously we could try to stop climate change, right? And most of the time when we read about climate change, this is the answer, is we just slow down climate change and everything gets better. This is one of the only small exceptions to this. Because milder climate change scenarios mean species can move faster, it means they can keep up with climate change, they lose less range. Those are actually the scenarios where we see this pattern is the strongest. And so there's no way to sort of back out of this process. Everything we do from here means that this is going to happen, and there's nothing we can do about that. And that's the end of the talk, right? I mean, that'd be a terrible end to the talk. Nobody wants to hear that talk. I'm going to run through 3 or 4 things we can do. First of all, there's surveillance, right? We can engage in projects like the Global Virome Project billion-dollar efforts to try to keep track of these processes as they happen. But in reality, this is a massive surveillance problem today, before we have these 15,000 new cross-species transmission events. We actually updated that 1.7 million viruses number last year in a study. It's still high, it's still 40,000 viruses in wildlife. Of them, about 10,000 could affect humans someday. We've only described about 1% of those viruses. The other 99% haven't been described, and they're all going to go through this process. They're all going to move because of climate change. And that is a massive obstacle for a surveillance system. Mitigation, I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, and I know we're going to talk about this, but cutting back climate change doesn't necessarily stop a lot of these things from happening. We live in a world that is 1.1 degrees warmer already. We are on track in the next 5 years to cross the 1.5 degree limit set by the Paris Agreement. We are looking at a world that is not likely to mitigate climate change enough to be safe. And so that leaves us with adaptation. And what I want people to take away from this, and this is what I say in every talk I give, from high-level government work to talking to 10 undergrads in a room, is that healthcare is the most important form of adaptation. And this has never been more true than during the COVID-19 pandemic, when we are seeing unavoidable conflicts between natural disasters and the pandemic, where climate change is already killing people today, and that is much harder to respond to and adapt to in a pandemic, because we don't have health systems that are robust to any kind of crisis, let alone several crises at once. What that means going forward is that I hope that people will think about this in those human terms. Normally I talk about the United States. I know we have a more global audience today, but I think the United States is useful here as a template, not because it is the center of the universe, but because it is an example of a health system we thought was strong and prepared for climate change and pandemics, and turns out in practice not to be. All of these different climate attributable threats are coming for the United States. We don't have a system that protects people from that. We have a system that amplifies inequities and creates justice problems in terms of health and climate change. And we spend more money on healthcare than any other industrialized country doing it. So there's no clear answer. I'm not going to get in front of you today and say, well, there's one specific solution to that, but I hope that going forward, as we all sit in our homes and deal with this pandemic alone and together, we'll think about this, right? We can build stronger health systems, not just in the US, but everywhere. The World Health Organization's goal for universal healthcare by 2030 is still achievable. It is eminently achievable, perhaps more than staying under the 1.5 limit of the Paris Agreement. Universal single-payer healthcare would save billions of dollars and is widely supported, not just in the US, but in most countries. One other thing I want to plug quickly at the end. All of the things I've talked about today are available in various work that we've put out over the last few months, either with collaborators at a number of institutions, including EcoHealth Alliance and Union of Concerned Scientists, but also through our consortium. I also wanted to say one last thing that sort of maybe ties this into the other two talks. I was hoping today to present a little bit of evidence we've been trying to put together that weighs all these things on the same scales. Can we compare first encounters in the wildlife trade to first encounters from climate change? But it turns out that unfortunately beta coronaviruses are, they're the system that's on everybody's mind. They're easy for us to track in our climate model, but no living animals that are known to be from species that are beta coronavirus hosts have been illegally imported into the United States in the publicly available data we intended to work with. So that makes this task a little bit harder. But there are ways that we can, I think, put these things on the same evidence base. And I think what is particularly important to say is that there is still no evidence, particularly after Juan on Market was ruled out, that SARS-CoV-2 is linked to the wildlife trade or to bushmeat. And there's going to be a paper in Science Today that talks about attributing it to bushmeat that's factually incorrect. And while we need to tackle the wildlife trade as a health problem, and we need to tackle climate change as a health problem, and all of these things matter, I think it's important that we be precise about what we're doing because of a broader vision, and what we're doing because of the COVID-19 pandemic. All of this stuff is explained in much greater detail in some of the work that we've put out. But I hope that, yeah, it all comes down to health systems, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. Thanks, folks. Oh, and you can read about the work that we're doing on our website, or find us on Twitter.
Thank you, Colin. That was really great. Wonderful talk. And Lucy and Astrid, thank you too for your excellent presentations. So now what we'd like to do is to open up for questions. And let's see if I can begin with some questions that we've received. We've received some questions for all the speakers. Let me start with a question for Astrid. Are there concerns that the wildlife trade law in China may affect food security, or that closing down consumption of wildlife could have other unintended consequences for people's livelihoods?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. So the wildlife trade for consumption that is being regulated is they're trying to focus on wild animals. So as I was saying, with the farming exemption list, and they're trying to make a distinction there. So things like pigs and cows, domesticated animals, will continue to be consumed, but specialty cuisine is what they're trying to curtail, at least. So I do believe that food security would be okay. And the second part of the question was about livelihoods, right? So I think that one of the things China is doing quite well is to, rightly so, focus on compensating these farmers, because you can't just take away someone's livelihood and then leave them out on the street, right? So they have been, it's different in different provinces and on different city levels even, but they've been giving loans, they've been facilitating transition to other industries, they've been, providing compensation so that they can start something new. And there's actually a famous account of a bamboo rat farming duo, like two brothers, and they were super famous on Weibo, and they were always holding up their bamboo rats like, oh, look at this guy, I'm gonna cook him. But now they have actually started doing medicinal plant farming, and they've changed. So, you know, I think that's the sort of thing that's happening, and I think that that is positive, and that should be something that people think about when they're giving these sort of advice of what to do, or they are implementing these types of policies.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask a question for Lucy. What kind of training is needed to build capacity in the communities for reporting disease outbreaks, and how to collect, integrate the data coming in from these communities, a lot of which are going to be very remote. And so I can imagine difficulties in terms of communicating that information through those pathways.
Yeah, that's a good question. It will, of course, vary from country to country and in different communities, but it's certainly a long process, and it has to be done with local governments and within existing frameworks, and building a national framework if that doesn't exist. So otherwise the data goes nowhere and nothing useful gets done with it. Cell phone technology has just been a massive advancement, and I'm often shocked. I'm from England, but the cell phone reception in remote parts of Laos where I've worked has been much better than most of it in rural England. And it really has been a phenomenal tool for various health reporting networks. So that's something we can build on with communities. A lot of these rural communities have community health workers and animal health workers who, the amount of training they have is adequate, and with the local knowledge they have is invaluable in terms of initial reporting, and then that needs to feed into a national response system within the districts and regions, and with rapid response teams is what we've been developing in the countries where we've worked with national governments to create that. And as we've said, rangers and hunters have been a phenomenal resource in working within their communities and with the wildlife that they see on a day-to-day basis to recognize changes that would otherwise just be completely missed.
Right.
It's a lot of work, yeah.
I've got a question for Colin. Colin, as the pandemic passes, carbon emissions that declined will most likely bounce back and then some more as industry makes up for lost income and productivity. So any slowdown is unsustainable. What lessons can we draw from these slowdowns and changes in human behavior that can be used to combat climate change impacts long term?
So I think this is a tough one, right? Because there's a lot of hope rolled up in this. We're at this inflection point in terms of how we talk about climate change and how we conceptualize ways out of this problem. And I think the sort of sinking feeling of disappointment a lot of people feel about emissions not staying lower after or during COVID is exemplary of that. But it's part of a broader pattern, right? We don't have a climate crisis because of individual actions. That's just fundamentally a truth that we've been trying to sort of pivot since 2006 in the era of inconvenient truth, from this model where we talk about personal choices and compact fluorescent light bulbs up to, well, actually it's about systemic change. And this is an example of that. We don't have a climate crisis because people haven't been staying in their houses. We have a climate crisis because of a global extractive industry and reliance on fossil fuels without multilateral cooperation among countries to eliminate that industry. And there's nothing but that we can do to stop the climate crisis. And I think it's hard to see this dip and momentarily feel like something is going well and not want to cling to that with everything we have. Particularly because we're also still living through a pandemic and many other kinds of hell world right now. But there's no shortcuts out of this. There have never been shortcuts out of this. Climate scientists have been saying this since the second or third IPCC report. If there is a lesson, I think it's that people are perhaps more willing and interested to engage in social goods than a lot of climate advocates have felt like they are. There's a lot of talk about climate despair versus climate optimism, right? And I think a lot of people have been losing steam over the last few years, very much myself included, because of how bad things have gotten. But people staying home during COVID and not just this emissions drop, but cooperation with stay-at-home orders and new social norms about masks and this sort of broad reinvention of society all tell us that people want things to be good and they want to be good for other people. And that sets us up to think about a post-COVID future, I think, very nicely, right? In the United States, that looks like a Green New Deal. There's no way out of this, right? Like, again, there's very few options actually on the table. I think from a policy standpoint, the Biden climate plan lays out a lot of basic things, but if we want to talk about reinvention of society after a pandemic, there's the Green New Deal or there's nothing, because it's reinvention or it's not. I think people want that reinvention. They want things to be better than this. They don't want another pandemic. They don't want a climate crisis. They want to build a better future together. And I think there's something in the idea that the pandemic is the start of maybe a new kind of social cohesion around that.
Thank you. We're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A. I just want to encourage all the attendees, if you have other questions, just pop them in the Q&A and we'll go through them. So I have a question for Astrid. There's been quite a bit of controversy around trophy hunting and conservation interventions regarding trophy hunting. And we have a question about whether there are any sort of disease angles with respect to trophy hunting and whether this should be a consideration within that discussion.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know exactly about any zoonotic disease spillover occurring because of trophy hunting, but it seems like the type of non-essential luxury wildlife trade item involving high-risk species like mammals in the wild that could be conducive to that. And one of the areas that seems like, from a completely zoonotic disease spread perspective, an area that could be regulated in order to mitigate the spread of disease down the line. But we have to remember always with regulating wildlife trade that we have to provide alternative livelihoods, because, and also we have to think about our own consumption, because the trophy hunting is usually Western people, right, going over there and shooting, or what did the canned lion thing. So it's really us that we have to reflect upon, right, and then regulate accordingly.
Thanks.
Another question for Astrid is this one here. Let me see if I can find it now. What's the public opinion around wildlife trade in China right now? Is this being discussed widely? What's the reaction to new policies? Is it limited to particular circles?
Yeah, so actually there's, China's a massive country, right? So it's difficult to say what the majority of people are thinking. There was a hashtag on Weibo that was trending. It was called Reject Game Meat, and it had over 45 million views, which is, a lot even by China standards. But then you have, I think, differing opinions depending on if it's urban or rural, and if it's someone involved in farming. There's over 6 million people involved in farming wildlife for food. So they've obviously been, not receptive to this. And there have been, when the Chinese government's been asking for feedback, they've been quite vocal in saying, resisting any regulation. But there was also a poll by Peking University, which surveyed over 90,000 people in just 1 month, and showed that 95% of people strongly are against eating wild animals. So I think it's a mixed bag, but it seems like urban people are probably a bit more feeling positive towards changing that. And then obviously the people who have vested interests in things staying the same are resisting.
Yeah, and I can, just to add to Astrid, outside of China, WWF did an interesting online survey, and they also found that 93% of people surveyed in Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Hong Kong would support government action to close illegal and unregulated wildlife markets in response to COVID-19. So there certainly are strong elements of civil society in Asia that support a ban on wildlife trade. These all come with caveats that their online surveys and rural communities may not have access to participate in those. So you're looking at a specific subset of society. But certainly there are some strong local sentiment in that.
Thank you. So I have a two-part question for Colin. So Sandra asked about the viral sharing model, whether it was published and available to see the methods.
Yeah, so the viral sharing model itself, the sort of backbone of viral sharing study, is out in Nature Communications, led by Greg Albury. Our study on climate change and viral sharing is available on bioRxiv. It's called Climate Change Will Drive Novel Cross-Species Viral Transmission.
Cool. So
yeah.
The second part of the question that I had was it strikes me, so you mentioned sort of healthcare being a really important sort of solution to a lot of this. And I wonder if the viral sharing mapping can inform either conservation interventions or healthcare interventions, given those results?
I think absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think what's difficult, right, is can we target particular threats within this model? So, for instance, the Ebola submodel is useful as a conceptual tool, right? It gives us a way to talk about the idea that things that are in one place might be in a bunch of other places in the future. But the more you zero in on any particular results, the more you have uncertainty in terms of how species behave, in terms of which climate scenario we end up in terms of the viral sharing itself, right? It's a random process. And we're talking in very coarse averages. And so I think there is a lot of room for forecasting as a tool to help prevent outbreaks and to help healthcare systems prepare for this kind of thing. This model is a little bit more broad scale. And I also think this model shows us that a lot of what is coming is much bigger than we can prepare for individually, right? We have this model of sort of single disease vertical interventions for One Health, right? Where we get to know a system very intimately and we prepare to respond to that system. We've spent decades studying Nipah virus, and we've gone from no understanding of where it comes from to a detailed understanding of which bats host it, differences in transmission between locations, and how we prevent outbreaks by, covering palm sap during harvesting, things like that. But that's one system that we've studied intimately for decades. And when we're talking about 10,000 potential viruses jumping into humans, when we're talking about 15,000 viral host jumps, when we're talking about the timescale of 50 years, I don't think there's any way, even if this was all that we did, every person on Earth for the next 50 years, if we all dropped our day jobs and just worked on this, there's no way we could prepare for each of those things individually, right? And this is why it comes down to health systems instead of interventions. A strong health system is one that's ready for any of those 15,000.
Here's a question for any speaker, so feel free to jump in. Here's a question for you. I've been wondering for a while whether each of the several Ebola outbreaks we've seen in Africa have needed a transmission from wildlife to humans, or whether there was only one transmission event and then there is a human reservoir that originates the different outbreaks. Would anybody like to attempt that one?
I can actually throw something out real easily on this. There's a paper from PLOS Pathogens from 2016 that essentially answers that question in really nice detail. It's called Ecological Context of Index Cases and Spillover Events of Different Ebola Viruses. It's by Seth Judson, and it walks through for all of the 35 plus Ebola outbreaks we've had over the last few decades, what we do and don't know. All of these have come from wildlife in some way. Sometimes we have some contact tracing the wildlife. Sometimes we know what the ecological circumstances were in terms of deforestation or a tree burns down or bushmeat hunting. But actually in a lot of cases, we don't know the circumstances. And that paper does a really beautiful job of itemizing that, and it's open access. I can put it in the chat if that actually works.
Great, so we have a question for Lucy. Was the outbreak of disease that killed the Saiga that you mentioned in Central Asia, was there any relationship to that in terms of habitat disturbance alongside the presence of animals, or were there other drivers that may have contributed to that?
It's really about human behavior in terms of livestock expansion. There's been traditional herding communities, but those behaviors are expanding. The land use that the ranges they're covering is expanding, and the herd sizes are expanding, but there's still minimal access to veterinary preventive care. So many emerging infectious disease events have been tied to agricultural expansion globally, and that's certainly a key area for wildlife pathogens as well as human pathogens. So it's more in terms of addressing that, we work with those communities to improve their veterinary preventive healthcare and management, so that makes their livestock and their income more robust, and they don't necessarily need to use such expansive species and such large numbers of species if the ones they have, if the animals they have are healthier. And then we're also working with kind of multinational agencies to bring that into the global efforts to eradicate PPR. So again, it's kind of a lot of collaboration across different networks. Yeah.
Here's a question for Astrid. How much of the legal wildlife trade that you mentioned is worth 200 billion is trade for consumption of wildlife? And is it an option to simply close that part of the trade down to prevent the next pandemic?
Well, so in that map that I showed you, there was 8 categories for wildlife trade, and the largest one by far is seafood. It just takes up like most of that 200 billion. And then there was one category that is wild meat, and that includes things like primate meat. Actually, it includes, I can't remember off the top of my head, but frogs' legs, yeah, things like that. And it was one of the smaller categories. It was one of the smallest in our 8 category legal wildlife trade analysis. But I think that there needs to be, basically the way that would happen is by consumers and national governments looking at high risk areas and deciding on a national level, we're not going to import this, we're not going to farm this, we're going to compensate the farmers in this way. And that would be the best way to go about it, rather than an international blanket ban just kind of out of the blue like that.
We have a question for Colin. I guess it's a 2-part question. So why do you think there is no evidence between SARS-CoV-2 and wildlife trade, and whether or not the phylogenetic relationships you were mentioning, maybe that has something to do with that issue?
Yeah, so I think it's very hard to prove a negative, right? I can't get up here and pull out a big pile of evidence that says no one has actually shown this link, but no one has shown the link. Just in very clear, basic scientific terms, there is no evidence that connects SARS-CoV-2 to the wildlife trade. What we had was the Huanan market. And as Lucy mentioned, environmental samples came back positive in the section of the market where wildlife was traded and sold. Most of the transmission that happened in the market appears to have happened in that part. And in the initial contact tracing in Wuhan, of about 100 cases, about half of them came from that market. However, in the initial China CDC report from January, they also report what they called extensive testing of wildlife samples and found no positives. Now, there's not a lot of detail presented in any of those things, and the WHO fact-finding mission will probably lead to what has been inevitably a publication of those results. I think a lot of people have seen the lack of that publication as evidence something is going on, and I think if I was sitting on probably the most important piece of wildlife virology to be published in the last year, I'd also take my time making sure I got it right, you know? And so those data, and this is sort of where this comes into this, those data fit the profile, I think, of either a spillover in that market or super spreading in that market. What we've seen since is increasingly other high intensity transmission events happening in markets like that one, including a wet market in Beijing last month, including a vegetable market in India 2 months ago, including a Whole Foods in Washington, DC, right? Supermarkets and markets in general are hot, densely packed places with lots of face-to-face contact, often very humid. And those are exactly the kind of circumstances in which we would see this kind of pattern, right? If you had a super spreading event in a market, it would look like this set of samples. So let me paint you a picture, right? Let's say I trade wildlife and I have picked up SARS-CoV-2 from some animal that I've encountered in the woods. When I come to the market, I see my favorite customers, I sell a lot of my merchandise, I get virus all over my gloves, and I get virus all over the desk, and I give virus to everybody who I come into contact with. And that's how you end up with human cases and positive environmental samples, but no positive animal samples. But this is where this gets tricky, right? Is that it could have been not the market, it could have not been related to the wildlife trade. And as of yet, we have no direct evidence of a virus close enough to SARS-CoV-2 in the wildlife trade for us to make this conclusion. And this is where the phylogenetic part comes in, right? So pangolin CoV was discovered pretty early in the outbreak. A lot of people thought it looked like a good fit for a, not just bridge host, but bridge virus between what rhinolophid bats have and SARS-CoV-2. I think after probably the most intense, phylogenetic arguments we've had in this field in a long time, the general consensus is that pangolin CoV does not look like an intermediary between, say, RATG13 and SARS-CoV-2. We don't have a sense of a bridge virus. We do have, though, broad senses of what could or could not have been an intermediate host. And yes, this is where that phylogenetic evidence comes in, right? We know that civets are likely to share with rhinolophid bats, not specific to coronaviruses, but because of phylogenetic and geographic patterns. The models that I talked about are completely agnostic to the identity of the viruses. It's just where things live and where things come into contact. That's true for pangolins, that's true for mustelids, including mink, and we predicted the mink outbreak without that in our data. We predicted pangolins without that in our data. And we also now increasingly know, right, that this kind of contact happens in natural ecosystems. There was a beautiful study from Africa last month that looked at pangolins and bats living together in these massive underground burrow systems in a completely natural way, right? That's a perfect environment for viral transmission. And so it doesn't actually just require the wildlife trade for, say, a bat and a pangolin to share a virus. That could happen completely normally. And so I think it's entirely possible we will learn SARS-CoV-2 came from the wildlife trade. SARS-CoV did, and a handful of other viruses have, right? Like there was a monkeypox outbreak in the US, SFV and Ebola are linked to bushmeat trade, but we don't actually tend to default to wildlife trade as an explanation for these things. There's only a handful of viruses that are linked to it. And right now we have sort of no hard evidence that tells us that.
Thanks, Colin. I've got a question for all speakers from one of our long-term members. The ATBC has members all over the world, many of whom are students or early career researchers. Are there any skills not typically taught in graduate school that have turned out to be essential in your respective fields, especially given their relevance to the current crisis? I'm thinking of things like conflict management, resolution, facilitation skills, how to interact with policymakers, etc. Would anybody like to take a crack at that one?
Sure. Well, I mean, the topics you mentioned, obviously every graduate degree will be different, and I did a postgraduate veterinary degree as well as the veterinary degree. Times will have changed, so I can't speak to what are in those curricula now, but certainly the concept of One Health and how interconnected everything was not taught at the time. In veterinary degrees, they tend to be also much more clinically focused, and I think we need to be better at including research and analysis of research in that. Communication is massively undervalued in general in broad scientific degrees, I feel, which obviously is a benefit in conflict management, in working together in these cross-disciplinary and multinational approaches that we need to start taking for more effective action going forward. So for sure, I think there needs to be an improved focus on that.
Astrid, would you like to?
Yeah, I think more of the same. It's a very interdisciplinary area, especially wildlife trade. You need to know about policy, you need to know biology, about virology, if you're going to do, research into viruses. and then things like alternative livelihoods for the communities that are affected. So definitely, I think we do need to rearrange and broaden what graduate studies include.
Colin, do you have an opinion on that? Or?
All I would add is just that the collaboration is the key to all of this, right? Interdisciplinarity doesn't come from being good at everything. It comes from having friends who are good at everything. You know, Verena is a wonderful system because everyone is the world expert on what they do. And most of the time, that means that we all feel very stupid. And that's a good sign, right? Seeking that out and actively pursuing that, being around people who make you go, oh my God, there's so much I don't know that I need to know. And seeking out those people, I think, is the key.
Yeah, great. There's one, I think, more open question. Astrid, you talked a lot about the new policies in China in response to COVID-19. Are you aware of other changes from other countries in Asia? Other policy changes?
Asia, yeah, Vietnam has announced a similar directive to what's happened in China, where they were saying that they want to ban domestic wildlife trade and consumption. But I don't know, I haven't followed up to see what actions have happened there. I did also see some news about Myanmar announcing that they were going to legalize or encourage the farming of certain species, wild species. I think pangolins was on the list, which is a high risk species. So, you know, the response has been uneven. And I do think that there should be more of a response coming from the developed world as well. I think that that's kind of missing here.
Okay, well, I think we've answered all the questions. Unless Tony, you have any last remaining ones?
I'm just looking through the notes here to see if we've got any other questions. One question for Colin. If the healthcare system of the US is not ready for climate adaptation, what is the model healthcare system that we should be looking to? Or if it doesn't exist, what would it look like? What would be its characteristics?
So this is a tough one. There's no one country I think we can point to, in large part because the model that works in any country has to be locally tailored, right? Climate adaptation is bottom up most of the time. It's about what works for individual societies. It's about what actually puts people at risk, what climate hazards people are going to experience. You know, we work with folks in Bangladesh all the time, and in Bangladesh, most of what we're thinking about is saltwater intrusion and dengue, and you know, that wouldn't necessarily help us prepare for what the future of climate change looks like in Connecticut, right? And so I think instead there are some broad principles, societies that focus on the right to health and international governance that focuses on the right to health is sort of key. Thinking about the idea of universal access, not just to coverage in general, but specifically to quality care, to affordable care. There are a lot of societies that have different versions of that, most of them with a universal single payer model. I think also just in the broadest terms, in terms of what a climate adapted system is, we can look to COVID as a model for who acted fast and well and who didn't. You know, there's been a lot of talk about sort of metrics for health security and for national preparedness that turned out to not be great predictors of COVID outbreaks. And I think that's because things work very different in a crisis than they do as a baseline. I'm a pretty calm and collected person, and when the fire alarm goes off, I'm not anymore, right? And that's true for, you know, entire countries as well. And so I think we can look to countries that have done a good job with responding to COVID as templates for what emergency mobilization means, in terms of templates for what multi-sector coordination should look like, and social cooperation and norms as well.
Great. Well, I think we've had a really excellent high level, but also sort of dynamic discussion here. As we wrap up, I wanted to give all of our panelists, just a few last words before we wrap it all up.
I can go first, maybe. I guess I just would reiterate that there's a moment here for everyone in terms of the general public and political will and just attention to this problem that we really should seize and in a smart and considered way make actions that will help mitigate the future, zoonotic outbreak. That's basically the main message here, I think.
Thanks.
Yeah, agreed with Astrid and what Colin said, that better collaboration going forward is key, and we just really need to recognize the fundamental importance of protecting our planet and better resiliency of towards climate change and potential pandemic risk going forward.
You guys have said it better than I could.
Great, thanks. All right, Tony, do you want to sign us off? Or?
Yeah, so Colin, Lucy, and Astrid, thanks so much for joining us tonight for these excellent talks that you've given us. And thanks to our members for joining. And this is the first of our 2020 series of webinars. We have another 5 webinars over the next couple of months. So we hope that members can join us for those. And just to let you know that after the webinars have been presented, they will be made available to everybody through the ATBC website. So we'll let you know when that happens, so you can share the links and people can see them. So thanks once again, speakers. Thanks everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next time. So goodbye for now. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.